So we're excited that Bernadette is back from Tanzania, and she has been gracious enough to offer to share some of her experience with us. Unfortunately, the projector does not want to cooperate with either of our computers this morning, so you're going to have to do some visualizing in your head of how beautiful Tanzania is. Also, the batik that Bernadette presented to us from her church in Tanzania is up here if you want to look at it afterwards. And then we'll bring it back in the sanctuary again for 11 o'clock. But take it away.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? I'm usually very loud. Okay. Well, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bernadette Amand. I was a Global Mission Fellow, also known as a Young Adult Missionary for the General Board of Global Ministries from 2017 until a few weeks ago. I served in northern Tanzania in a village called Gamasara with a local organization called the Amand Center for Women and Children. I worked with local community leaders to advocate for the rights and health of women and girls. We spent a lot of time talking about why people love their community and the things that are painful and the things that they wanted to change. We talked with both women and men. We talked with families and community groups. We also listened. People had lots of things to tell us. In short, my job was to help this community tell their stories. Because until people could listen to each other, nothing would change. Stories can do a lot of things. They can be therapeutic, they can unite people and build community, and they can spark change. For people who have gone through very difficult things, like talking about those events, can be really hard. Like the woman who thought she was going to die while in labor because her doctor couldn't help her and got afraid and left the room. Or the little boy who grows up watching his mother getting beaten by his father over and over again for years. It can take a long time, sometimes years, before someone is prepared to speak about those things out loud. But other stories are quick to be told, like the process over months and months and months of building the local church. And now that it's finished, why it has 6 sides. Or the story of how Tanzania gained independence and was guided safely through its infancy as a country by the first president. I have always believed that my story starts with my name, Bernadette. My full name is Bernadette Marie Amand. Those of you who have lived in South Louisiana for a long time will know probably a few things about me because of my age. You might assume that I'm from a Catholic family, and you would be partially right. You might guess that my ancestors are French and not Acadian, and why that's important. Bernadette is a name that demands your attention. Bernadette has a big ego and lots of opinions. Bernadette is right all the time. Bernadette is a particular combination of trusting and confident. The right mixture to go and live in Tanzania for 2 years alone, speaking no Swahili. So, Bernadette moved to Tanzania. And it didn't take Bernadette long to figure out that her name, Bernadette Marie Amand, doesn't really tell a story. In fact, Bernadette is not even a name that most Tanzanians can pronounce. So instead, I was called Bernadette, or simply Zulu, white person. Each day I spent in Damsara, I witnessed women change through the stories that they shared. One woman spoke of the joy of being able to send her children to school, even though their husband was not helping to pay the fees. One woman rejoiced when the sturdy cement block house she had been slowly building for years was finally finished and she could move in. One terrified woman spoke about being circumcised, how decades later she still remembers what it felt like, and how she felt betrayed by her family for coercing her into the ceremony. I learned that when one woman is brave enough to share a difficult story, other women rallied with similar experiences. And I learned that they hadn't spoken out before because they thought they were alone and didn't bother to share lest they be ignored or chastised. But once the stories were told, they were no longer the burden of any one person. Rather, the weight was spread across a circle of women. story became the story of all the others too. And slowly, the stories that the women told ended with messages of hope and healing, and sometimes even a call to action. I, however, was still Bernadette. Bernadette wasn't very confident. She was afraid to speak because people laughed at her Swahili. She sat in the back of the room because her white skin attracted stares, no matter where she was or how much skin she tried to cover. She didn't want to ruffle feathers or cause offense in a place so different from her home. I knew that Bernadette would never really be a part of Tanzania, but I also didn't want to be Bernadette, this meek and frightened person that I was ashamed of. Then one day, Bernadette made it into someone else's story. Bernadette, I, had agreed to stay with my good friend Sarah until she had her baby. And the very first night I stayed in her home, Sarah woke me up in the early hours of the morning with birth pains. So Sarah, her husband, and I, in the utter blackness of a place with no electricity, but under a vast blanket of stars, waded through the cornfields and scooted along cow paths, stopping for the contractions, until we finally reached the main road, where a friend with a car waited to bring us to the hospital. We arrived in time. The doctor did not leave. And Sarah's husband and I waited nervously for a few hours until a very tired nurse emerged from the delivery room with a small bundle, which she placed in my arms. Bernadette is a part of that story. And others became a part of my story, like my roommate Cynthia, who was just as terrified of mice as I, and had no problem enticing a neighborhood kid into catching them for us. And there were many times my Swahili failed to communicate what I needed to say. Like the one time at a staff training, I boldly announced, "Yes, I am drunk," instead of, "Yes, I understand." Or when I had insisted that a shopkeeper let me exchange my used underwear rather than my used soda bottles. Bernadette didn't speak so much, but she listened. She didn't tell any jokes, but she laughed at jokes others told. Bernadette was the one that actually lived the challenge that Bernadette signed up for. My work in Tanzania was to help make room for new identities based in community and love through telling stories. I hadn't realized that Gamasara had given me the same gift when they gave me my new name, Bernadette. Being called a name familiar to this community was an invitation to join in with my neighbors and to make space for love. So now you all have heard this story, and so you are now invited to make space for love. So that's the end of the formal presentation. I had some photos and a map of Tanzania, but the Holy Spirit did not want that to happen today. So I guess I'll just tell you briefly more specifics about sort of what the program I was involved in is and how it's connected to the United Methodist Church, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes if anyone has questions. So I was a Global Mission Fellow, which I operated under the General Board of Global Ministries, which is affiliated with the United Methodist Church. So I was sort of going as a representative and missionary of the United Methodist Church. And all of the Global Mission Fellows who are under the age of 30 were recruited from all over the world. So this is not just Americans, but people from everywhere sent to different countries than the ones that we're from. And all of the work must be justice-based work. So whether that's recognizing social justice or environmental justice or projects that are sustainable within a local community. Those are the kinds of projects that Global Mission Fellows do. My project, I sort of explained, I think, the important things to me about the work that I did, but in a more general way, I worked for a center for women and children that was sort of co-led, co-started by the local church, Gamasara UMC, who sent this lovely batik as a gift. And the original idea was to be a place that would advocate for the needs and rights of women and children. But for several reasons sort of got sidetracked and began doing a lot of economic projects to support women, which was good work. But then right before I got there were some women that started asking, what else can we do? Is there a bigger picture? There are bigger problems in this community that we want a place to, and we want a place to talk about these. And so then when I arrived, what I did was I did a lot of listening and sort of help shift the work that was being done to focus a little bit more broadly on issues that community leaders identified as problems and that they wanted to change regarding the women and children in their community. So Gamasara, which is the name of the village, is way north, about 20 minutes away from the Kenyan border. And yeah, maybe after, if we have some time, I'll tell you the story about how I crossed the border illegally one time. But I won't do that here.
Why not?
It's a long story. But yeah, I think that's it. I traveled a lot by motorbike because I didn't have a car to drive and there weren't like buses. It was too rural of a place for that. So that's a fun thing. I don't know, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
What were the issues that you found yourself working on?
So, generally, there's a lot of domestic violence that happens. Education is a big issue. Most children, it's technically all children are required to go to school, but class sizes are really big, like upwards of 200 sometimes with one teacher. And you still have to pay for things like school uniforms. Some schools, even if they're public, require kids to bring like grain and things as a contribution to feeding all of the kids. And many families can't make that happen. And so those kids either don't start school until very late, like 9, 10, or they just don't go at all. And so that was another issue. Female circumcision was a big issue, which nobody told me until about 3 months into my stay there, which I think is just a testament to the knowledge that they give to visitors and people that they see as outsiders. And so I felt very privileged and honored that I was given the opportunity to learn about their culture, which is in some ways tied to circumcision. That I was led into that community in a way that, allowed me to hear some of those things that were really hard to talk about. So yeah, those are the majority of the issues that I dealt with. But sort of poverty in general was a big deal and touched a lot of people. But, I learned that, people are people everywhere, and, once you are embedded in a community and you have family and friends there, it just feels like any community.
Were there any men involved in any of the projects, or at least were the men in the village supportive of the work you were doing?
Yeah, so the question was, were there any men involved? There were. So any projects that we did that benefited women or that were to benefit people financially, we always wanted the beneficiaries to be women, but we certainly involved men in the advocacy part. If you ask any woman, she had usually a lot of things to say and was very willing to tell you about the things that she liked in her life and the things that she wanted to change. And the resounding answer was, we know the problems, our men don't. Often. Or if they do, they don't feel safe enough or supported enough to voice them. And so we spent a lot of time in small groups, working with men and women, sometimes together, sometimes apart, in ways to be good community advocates and talk about these issues. So yes, we did.
How much English was spoken at all?
In the small town, in the village where I was, not very much. almost totally Swahili. There were a few school teachers around me that spoke English, and so I connected with them until I got better at Swahili, but it was mostly Swahili.
You've been back for a few weeks. What do you miss most about living in Tanzania, and what, if anything, do you miss the least?
There's so many things I miss. I guess just my family. There's a lot of people there now that are forever going to be a part of me, and so I miss them greatly. The thing I miss the least is a food called kichori, which basically is like it's like the contents of a cow stomach that you fry up with like some onions and tomatoes, and you eat it. I don't miss that.
So you said your role is kind of help people tell their stories. Who are they telling their stories to? That's what I'm not clear on.
Well, so a few different groups of people. Firstly, the first part of my time there, we did some community discernment and found out that they wanted the women and community leaders wanted to act on this issue of female circumcision. And so we spent a lot of time sort of teaching our local leaders how to advocate, sort of the skills that it takes to be a community advocate. And then at the end of the first year, we did this big camp for girls that was sort of a celebration of, for families who chose to non-circumcise their daughters who were of age. But then we found, and so, stories were told sort of during that process, right? This is why this is an important issue for me. This is how it has touched my life. But what we learned from that is it's really hard to tell those stories in a big public setting if you're still sort of dealing with how hard those things are in your heart. And so then the second half of my time, we spent constructing a trauma healing plan, which was story-based. And so they were just getting rolling as I left, but the idea was that there would be small sort of covenant groups where people could share, could learn how to tell a story that's healthy for people who have experienced trauma. Not with necessarily the intention of sort of sharing it with other people until they were ready, but just having a small group of confidence that could be supportive and non-judgmental of the things they have to say. That's your question. Yes?
Okay, so we've been having a lot of conversations about General Conference 2019 and the issue of human sexuality. And since you just spent 2 years in Tanzania, which is in fact in Africa, and can you speak a little bit to either A, why that's not as big of an issue for the African delegates, or two, can you kind of explain that process as you understood it and experienced it?
Sure. So what I experienced and what I heard in my very small part of Africa was that people didn't really talk about human sexuality at all. And I had a few friends that talked with me about it. And it was sort of like a don't ask, don't tell deal, like, let them live their lives, it's fine. The government of Tanzania has done some really awful things to people that they claim and suspected were engaging in homosexual activities. And that's really hard and violent and scary. But the church, the sense that I got was that they just weren't ready to talk about it. It's not an issue that is present in their communal conversations. And I believe that change starts from within a community. So, I think that the conversation that's being had in the United Methodist churches in the U.S. is timely because it's something that we can't avoid talking about. But in Tanzania, nobody even talks about it. And so to have a church that is international come in and say, we need to vote on this issue, feels very similar to the church in earlier ages when we came in and said, you need to do these things. And that's really hard because, I think we believe that we've moved past that. But I think for me, it was just a reminder that we haven't. And so we both have the responsibility to remain as a church in communion with our friends and neighbors all over the world, even if it's really hard. And so I don't have a real direct answer to that question, but that was sort of the sense that I got. Yes.
There is a book called Red Tent, which talks about women's culture in an era of the country. But it really helped me to understand the sisterhood that is created amongst women. And if your focus really on women, was the culture that you were a part of monogamous, one man, one woman, or was it one man, 10 women, that kind of thing?
So the tribe that I worked with primarily was called the Korean tribe, or people who are Korean were called Wakuria. And actually, traditionally, they are a polygamous tribe. So there were many in the community that had several wives, but there were a lot of mosques and a lot of churches in the area also, and so I think most of those communities emphasize monogamy. One issue that we had as a United Methodist Church is that sometimes men would join the church if they had several wives because they no longer wanted several wives, and according to the book of discipline, you can only have one wife. And so it was a really easy way to divest of these extra women that then had to find a way to live on their own without the support of their husbands. So, a little bit of a different issue that United Methodist Church faced, but yeah.
How much influence did the local church have on your project? And I mean, how much did religion really permeate what you were doing, or was it more a practical approach you guys were trying to do?
I would say that religion and practicality are merged pretty well, but not just Christianity. So the program was originally out of a local United Methodist Church, but we wanted the program to be sort of interfaith, I guess. And so it was still sort of supported by the church, but we were very clear that this was a community program. And so we had girls and we had women and we had men from all over the community, some who were non-religious, some who practiced traditional religion, some were Christian, some were Muslim, and we wanted as much diversity as possible. Because in the end, I think many people found the strongest ties to be that of their community or that of their tribe, sort of over that of their religion.
When you told the story about the baby being delivered and being taken to the hospital, before you got there, I expected you under the stars with the husband to deliver that baby. So the care, they have hospitals, they have reasonably good health care with doctors and nurses in general.
Working on it. It's an ongoing attempt to have better health care.
But you could have had to deliver that baby.
Yes, I was quite prepared to do so. I mean, unprepared. Stealing myself for the horrid reality that that would have to happen. I saw him the other day.
Did you ever feel like you were in danger?
Not really. For the most part, I felt very safe. I lived in a very small community, and so there were a few times when, there were strange people who I didn't understand what they wanted, who would walk up to me. But there was always somebody else who came over to help me because everybody knew who I was by the end. I was the one white person that lived there. So.
What was the population of the community you were in?
Numbers. I don't know. Like really small. Sorry. I don't have any numbers. I can maybe find this for you later.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah,
I'm trying to get the sense.
really small. Yes.
So I know that you had fundraisers while you were gone because you have to pay forward, and is there someone in line to sort of help facilitate what you built now that you're gone? And is your fundraising complete, or there's still ways that our church can support what you started?
So my fundraising is complete, though if you want to donate, we can certainly talk about that. Because the Emmanuel Center is an ongoing project, so you can donate to them. I do have someone who will be coming after me, who's also a GMF. She's from the Congo. Her name is Sylvie, And I don't really know that much about her, but we've kind of been in contact. She has a social work background and will be sort of taking over for me and hopefully expanding in new ways. Was there another hand over here?
Can you talk about where you lived? So you talked about Gamasara.
Yes.
Did you live there for a day?
No, I actually didn't live in Gamasara, Mom. So glad you asked. So the structure of the area I was in is villages traditionally, but then there were like larger like towns that people would go like for the market to sell things to, get what they needed for the week. And the closest town was called Tarime, which is not a Swahili word. It's a Korea word. I can't remember what it means, but it has to do with things not growing there, and that's why there's a town there. But that's where I lived, was in the town of Tarime. And it was about an hour's walk from town to Gamasara, the village, or about a 10-minute piki ride. Piki is a motorbike. Well, motorbike taxis in Bogota. But anyway, yeah. So often I would ride motorbikes to work in the mornings and get picked up in the afternoons and go back to town. Yes.
You talked about or mentioned domestic violence. Did the church have some sort of plan, or was there a safe house, or was there anything that addressed that, or how did you communicate and counsel in that area?
So there wasn't really anything formal. And there weren't really emergency resources for people fleeing domestic violence. And that's what made the work so difficult, because we as a community center also didn't really have the resources for that. And most of our leaders were from the local community, and they often voiced that they were afraid of sort of standing in support of something that was so direct and immediate. Because, I mean, everybody had a story about a neighbor that they could hear, engaging in some kind of violence in the home. And so people were just so afraid, even people who didn't like it. And so that's sort of still where we are. I think people are finally, when I left, we're beginning to talk about those things in concrete ways and saying, what is a plan that we can have? Even if we don't have a place, can the pastor go and sort of reach out to the husband? Is there a woman who can go and then, along with the pastor, sort of tend to the needs of the woman at that time? But we didn't really have a formal plan. Yeah.
When I visited Union of South Africa, the northern part of the country, they would have very small villages, and all decisions were made by the chief. Is that the same political kind of structure you have, where he would allow people to have land, he would make major decisions if they could have a school or not?
So Tanzania is quite civic, and so it is, while they use villages as like a grouping, a political grouping, they were either appointed or elected leaders. So, I think those leaders did deal a lot with land and that kind of thing, but it was all within a formal government system.
What are the religious demographics as far as percentage of Muslim or Islam? And is the female circumcision mostly associated with Islam, or is that more of a cultural thing amongst other groups?
So across the country, it's about 40% Islam and Christianity, and then the rest sort of being Hinduism or like traditional religions. Where I was, it was more Christian than it was Islam. Down the coast, where there's a lot of trading with North Africa, is where the concentration of Muslims are mostly. But there are a few. And actually, FGM, female circumcision, doesn't happen in most places in Tanzania. There are a few tribes that it's associated with. And so I was in one of the areas where the tribe that lived there predominantly still practiced circumcision. So it was not really associated with religion, though some people sometimes talked about Islam, but mostly it was just tribes.
In your Christian community where you were, can you talk about the Christian holidays that celebrate Christmas and Easter? And if so, how similar or how dissimilar were they between there and here?
Just like a lot of church, just like 8 hours worth of church. Yeah. So there wasn't like for Christmas, a culture of gift buying or gift giving. It was you go to church, and then same thing with Easter, which felt like a bigger deal than Christmas there, which perhaps it should be, I don't know. But yeah, so if you went to church on Christmas for 5 hours, then you knew that the Easter service was going to be 8 hours. So, you know, advertising for the future. But yeah, just church.
In that 5 or 8 hour period, are you eating a meal or are you
There's usually a meal after. Moms often brought like snacks and bananas. But also church was not, I'm not saying it wasn't hard. 8 hours of church was hard. But church is like more movement happens. People are standing and dancing. Some people leave. You know, if you have to go to the bathroom, you go and you come back. You know, children are walking around, nobody really cares. So it's a little bit of a different feel than the way that we think of the church in this congregation.
You said, of course, there's a lot of poverty, and I'm assuming in the village it's mostly agricultural, but do people from the village in any great percent walk or drive into the city to work at jobs?
There is like a very small business class of people where I was. And then people would go to town to like sell extra vegetables and things. But most people sort of stayed where they were and did subsistence farming.
How much contact did you have in the outside world? TV or radio?
I had internet. The connection was usually pretty good. So.
The villagers, how much contact would they have with the outside?
Not very much. There was not electricity. I think they had put up one pole for like an organization sort of into the middle of the village. But most of them didn't have electricity. Most people had like a little like Nokia phone, like the old-fashioned ones with the buttons. And so like they could call each other. Some people had smartphones, but often if they could use them depended on, you know, if they made the town to charge it and whatnot.
So then they weren't really reacting to the world events or whatever?
There were radios, and so things that affected Tanzania, they often knew about. They knew about President Trump. So that's great. Hold on.
You mentioned the community leaders. I'm assuming they were men, and if so, how much pushback did they get for trying to further women's issues?
Sure. So I actually met men and women. The village would have identified the men in that group as the community leaders. And we did a lot of maneuvering in order to both keep them involved as well as help them understand the value of the women leaders around them also. But because of that and because of the way that we knew people would recognize them as having a voice that mattered over the women, it was really crucial to have them involved and have them brave enough to stand up in support of us and the work that we're doing. Yes.
I'm trying to picture children in this culture. Are children cherished? Are children not to be heard or seen? Are children to work when they're 5 years old? That go out in the field and work?
So there were a lot of children. And I think people love children, but that didn't mean that some of those other things didn't happen. So some of the things that stood out to me in a good way were how trusting a community was. So if there were kids around and you were the adult, then you were responsible. There wasn't this where your parents thing. It's like, well, I'm the parent until somebody else comes along. And so that meant feeding kids, you know, if they got hurt, making sure they were okay, all of that. But disciplining happened, sometimes in abusive ways, sometimes just loudly or, in ways that overstressed parents act sometimes. So yeah, it's sort of a mixed bag, but I got the message that people wanted to know how to love their kids better. Because often you just sort of do what you grow up seeing. And most parents became parents at a very, very young age. And so, never really had the opportunity perhaps to think about, how they wanted to raise children, just that there were children to raise. And so people were always thirsty for knowledge on, why is my kid, my kid was doing great in school, but, a week ago he is no longer doing well, why might that be? There are always parents who are concerned and wanted to know how to love their kids better.
How big a role did music play in the church?
I think a big role. There's a lot of singing and dancing, just quite different. Yes?
I was just wondering what percentage of the parent age or older lead in life?
I would say probably under the age of 30, like 50% probably, and then above that, it would be lower, like probably 30%. Elderly people?
What is the
They usually still worked, but were very much respected and given sort of deference to speak and the best place at the table, things like that.
Tell us about your excursion to Kenya.
What's that?
Tell us about your excursion to Kenya. Your trip across the border.
Nothing bad happened. I went across the border to exchange money illegally because we had some volunteers that came without cash to pay for their visas. And so I thought I could get it on the Tanzanian side, and I couldn't. And so I snuck across the border and then paid an exorbitant amount for USD, and then I snuck back across. That's really it. I'll tell you the more exciting version later.
So I wondered if you could kind of explain the kind of unusual way that you're greeted in Tanzania, the customary hujambo, and what it means, because I think it's particularly fascinating.
Hujambo specifically?
Yeah, like hujambo, sujambo, what it means.
So the word jambo, the root of hujambo is, it means like issues. Do you have any issues? So usually when you see somebody on the road in passing, you say hujambo, which actually means no issues. And then your response is sijambo, which is no issues. So yeah,
You can't say you're doing bad.
Right.
It's great.
Right. You always have to have, it's always a positive response.
Even though it's a negative connotation.
Sometimes you say sijambo lakini, which is like no issues but. But like you wouldn't usually do that in passing.
Could you talk about the other greeting back and forth that
The
happened?
shikamo. Okay. So if you're, and this only happens in Tanzania. There are other countries that are Swahili speaking, but this is a greeting that only happens in Tanzania. And I tried it in Kenya once, and all the old people looked at me. So if you are greeting an older person, you say shikamo, and their response is marahaba, and shikamo means I'm under your knee. And then the response is, yes, you are under my knee. It's just really a respectful greeting, and most people don't think about what it means, but it's, pretty specific.
So an older person is who, Bernadette?
What?
An older person is who?
Anybody, literally anybody older than me. So one of the jokes that young people often did with each other was like, how old are you? Oh, you're 23, I'm 24. You should tell me shikamo. There's a lot of that.
Are there any last questions before we give Bernadette a break?
Is there a lot of humor? Is humor a part of their culture?
Yes. Very different from American humor, and they didn't laugh at my jokes. But they laughed